Shyam Sankar, the CTO of Palantir. Thank you so much for joining Bloomberg.
Thank you for having me.
We're at this event where they're bringing together the greatest minds of Silicon Valley with elected officials, and it feels like more than ever we see tech titans in Washington, D.C. Coming from Palantir, how do you right now view the military-industrial base under the Trump administration?
Well, I think this is an opportunity to really fix a lot of the problems that have built up over the last 30 or so years since the end of the Cold War. If you go back to what it was like, what did the industrial base look like when we were winning in World War II and the early Cold War? It was actually a very different economic structure. Chrysler built cars and missiles. We had a Deputy Secretary of Defense that was the co-founder of HP. Bill Perry was the co-founder of a Silicon Valley startup before he became Secretary of Defense. So it's a return to the functioning cross-pollination of innovation that's always existed and been in the bedrock of how the American economy worked.
50% of Palantir's revenue comes from government contracts. Do you expect that level to stay the same? Will accelerate under the Trump administration?
I think it's been that way for a pretty long time. Obviously, we started entirely government. The commercial sector is bigger. It's growing very, very rapidly. But I think there's something quite healthy about having this diversified R&D base where everything we're learning and inventing in the very dynamic American private sector is actually benefiting our national security and broader functioning of government. You know, we were able to develop and deploy the Operation Warp Speed supply chain in 2 weeks because actually 2 years prior we'd solved a very structurally similar problem for BP and oil and gas. And you really cannot connect those dots prospectively. You can only see that retrospectively. And that's exactly what happened with SpaceX. You know, when I was a kid growing up in the shadow of the Space Coast, it used to cost $50,000 a kilogram to get to orbit on the shuttle. With Starship Heavy reuse, it's now 10 to 20 bucks. I'm not missing any zeros there. You know, it's just wild innovation that comes from that cross-pollination. This happened with Intel. In the late 60s, 96% of Intel's revenue actually came from the Apollo program. It was effectively a government contractor. But actually, Bob Noyce, the inventor of the transistor, the CEO of Intel, he always had a vision that integrated circuits were going to be in every consumer device. And he invested in that capability, and in the 70s and 80s, that enabled us to build a Saltbreaker, which meant that we didn't have to match the Soviets weapon for weapon. We could actually build smarter weapons and have many fewer of them that we could afford and still have deterrence.
So even if your government revenue comes down, it's because you're making money elsewhere in the private sector?
Yeah, and to be clear, I don't think the revenue is going to come down. It's just that there are going to be differential growth rates here. Yeah.
So I would love to get your take as well on Trump's Golden Dome. We know Anduril's part of this. We know SpaceX is part of this. Will Palantir be part of this project?
Well, we aspire to be. I think Golden Dome is very early on. I think that the most impressive thing about the executive order around Golden Dome is setting the time frame. You know, Alex Karp has famously said, if you want to have a project succeed, cut the time frame in half and then divide by 5 again. You know, and so setting a time frame that this thing has to be operational inside of the administration is the forcing function that enables everyone to reimagine how you're going to go about solving the problem and is changing the kind of inertia of how people would have solved it before. That's going to create a lot of innovation, a lot more capability, bring a lot of new players to the space.
You said aspiring to. So should we be expecting an announcement at some point?
I have no comment on that.
What about working together with Anduril on this project specifically?
It's going to take a team of super friends, of American champions to solve these problems. Anduril, many others. I think one of my observations is the Last Supper was this dinner in the Pentagon in '93 where the American people expected a peace dividend. We had won the Cold War. For every dollar we were spending in defense, we were going to start to spend 33 cents. It was going to be a massive cut. And this dinner was really to tell the 51 primes, today we have 5, tell the 51 primes, you're not all going to survive. You have our permission to consolidate. And some of you are going to have to get out of the business. And the conventional explanation of what happened at that is that's when we lost competition in the defense industrial base. I don't think that's actually the most devastating consequence. The consequence is that this consolidation bred conformity. It really pushed the founders and the innovators out of defense into other parts of the American economy. And then we had really the financialization of defense, you know, companies that became 100% defense companies. When the Berlin Wall still stood in '89, only 6% of spending on major weapon systems went to defense specialists. That means 94% of the spending went to dual purpose companies like General Mills, a cereal company that built torpedoes. You know, and Kodak, we think of them as a camera company, but they were actually a spy company. or Goodyear Tire. They were not just a tire company. Or Ball. They didn't just make glass jars, they built satellite buses. Ford built satellites until 1990. We forget how much the present moment is the anomalous thing. And so I think this whole movement, having all these folks together now, the opportunity with us, with the administration, is to get back to what winning actually looked like, to honor the primacy of winning.
You mentioned the Berlin Wall. What do you make right now of Germany rearming? Do you have a role to play in Europe?
Well, one of the fastest parts of our business that's growing is what we call warp speed. It's our modern manufacturing operating system. How do you integrate everything from how you design things to how you produce things, how you manage the supply chain? How does that enable you to have asymmetric advantages and how quickly you can do that? That's been broadly adopted by all of the new defense players as well as some of the legacy players. I think we have a big role in providing that capability to the Europeans as well. I think it's a great thing that the Europeans are rearming and taking this seriously. Innovation is a consequence of productivity. If you aren't making these things, you don't know how to innovate on making them. We used to build 500,000 rounds of 155 a month at the end of World War II. We're struggling now to get to 65,000 rounds, and we're kind of a little self-satisfied at the rate of production. But we've lost so much know-how of how to do these things that you're only going to build back by getting serious about rearming.
But do you see an opportunity, especially with the talk about more fiscal spending, to maybe put more employees or more capital into Europe?
I think we're going to follow the demand there. I mean, like the Europeans just adopted, NATO just adopted Maven. I see the threats are very serious. People are getting serious about it. Software is something you can field in weeks, not years. There is no FMS backlog for this stuff. The Taiwanese are waiting on 66 F-16s. There's a real question, can you deliver them inside the Davison window or not? They're kind of the constraints of physics. That's a hard problem to solve. I think warp speed can help reduce the time to do that, but there's the broader issue of how much lethality deterrence can we deliver to our allies to help share the load.
Who do you think is the biggest threat right now
China.
to the United States?
China, without a doubt.
Do you agree with how the administration is approaching China? Right now, the president, I know this isn't your realm, but at least when it comes to trade, he says he's talking to Xi Jinping. The Chinese say there are no calls on any level, no negotiations happening. Do you like their approach in dealing with Beijing?
That's not my métier. I'm a technologist by trade, but I think what I like is that we're taking the threat very seriously and we recognize that it's against all of the domains. It's not purely military. There is a deep economic component to this. One of the items that's near and dear to my heart is actually pharmaceuticals. My father was a pharmacist. He built the first pharmaceutical manufacturing facility in Africa in the 70s. And his dying wish to me was to reshore production in the U.S. And I think if we look with clear eyes at WuXi and what it's been able to do to hollow out, it's almost been this tacit conspiracy between Big Pharma and WuXi to kill Little Pharma. They've killed Kendall Square in Boston. Where are these innovative biotechs? And by outsourcing the low end, we ended up actually moving all the innovation overseas. And that is a national security problem.
I want to get your thoughts just on the end here, because you have all these government contracts, you deal with the Defense Department. What's your evaluation thus far of Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth?
I think Pete's doing a great job. I mean, when I look at the culture change, the motivation in the force, the clear-eyedness of doing things differently because we know the old things aren't going to work, and having the courage to do that, I think everyone who's been involved with defense innovation and trying to change the system would line up behind the secretary.
Are you concerned with how he conducts some of his businesses and the conversations he has at the DoD?
What I know how to comment on is really the credibility of the approach, and there I see that we have someone who's shaking things up, doing things differently, doing things we know are going to lead to productive outcomes.
Do you think he's at risk of being fired?
I'm a technologist.